everyone was like, all right, we're behind schedule, let's just get to this quickly. And I was like, no. Uh, okay, so I'm not going to show you a video, apparently. Instead, I'm just going to show you these screenshots. And so, in Mortician's Tale, in the game, you are tasked with the daily tasks actual morticians have in actual real life. So preparing of the bodies of the deceased for burials and cremation. This is a contrast from the comedy that was just happening right now. But you're also attending the respective funerals for each member of the deceased and overhearing conversations with their loved ones. And there's a bit of business elements to it too, so going through the protagonist's emails and interacting with her bosses and coworkers and clients, etc. And we launched a Mortician's Tale for PC, Mac via Steam, Humble, and itch.io last October. So this is the agenda for the talk. I'm going to do a very, very brief history on the history of death in video games. I'm going to talk about my personal history with death in video games and how that influenced Mortician's Tale. Most of this talk is going to be about developing a Mortician's Tale, and then at the very end I'm going to talk about other indie game devs doing cool things with death, and also close the talk with strategies on how you can also do cool things with death in your games. So, a very, very brief history on death in video games. So death has existed in video games as long as the medium has existed, as a way to punish the player and challenge them to do better. And since then, we've seen some innovations on how we use death in video games, from things like life systems to respawning to regenerating health or shields. We've seen innovations on how damage is displayed, from health bars to damage vignettes and everything in between. And we've seen different death mechanics that innovate on game design altogether, that challenge the player to take death seriously. So this can be things like permadeath, really, really difficult combat, or the loss of items and progress permanently. We've also seen a lot of innovation on how we use death narratively, and I kind of want to focus on this a little bit because Mortician's Tale is a narrative game. It is a thing that's really important to us and our team, and in my opinion, it's the area of game design in which players take death the most seriously. So most often in games, the way that we see death used narratively is as a way to motivate the player to play the game. So usually it's at the very beginning of the game, and it is your character's spouse or partner or child being killed off, usually in a cutscene, usually off screen. But there's been a lot of better ways to kind of use death narratively. So a good example of this is the Mass Effect series, which encourages players to build up relationships with characters before they get killed off. And most of the time, the deaths of these characters are because of choices that you've made as the player. So you're directly responsible for those deaths and need to kind of deal with that impact over multiple games. And so when I do my podcast, every guest I have, I like to ask them if they have a memorable video game death. And I will say like 80% of the time, they always bring up Aerith from Final Fantasy VII. And this makes a lot of sense if this is a game that you kind of grew up with, because they do a really, really good job at handling death, both narratively and mechanically. So in Final Fantasy VII, you have multiple characters that you can add to your party, but the game is designed so that Aerith is the dedicated healer. So most likely you're going to be using her in your party. And so when they kill her off, spoiler alert, the game's like 20 years old. When they kill her off, it's not just like, oh, this character that I liked is gone. It's also, you have to rethink how you've been playing the game. Because up until now, you've been using her, and from here forward, you have to now rethink about how you're going to play the game. It is a really, really good mechanical way to represent grief and like something being taken away from you and how you can move forward without them. And Final Fantasy VII and Mass Effect are both really, really strong examples because they marry narrative and mechanics together. And there's a reason why these games are always brought up. Lots of games feature death, but very few ask players to actually deal with it. And so I want to talk about my most memorable video game death. And this is a game that got me interested in game development on the whole, but also how it got me interested in the subject matter to begin with. So this is me. When I was about 9 or 10 years old, a girl in my class and her mom died in a very, very horrific way. And it messed me up. I developed some really, really serious death anxiety. I couldn't stop thinking about death. I couldn't stop thinking about how I was gonna die, how my mom was gonna die. I developed some separation anxiety. I couldn't go to school. It was just hell for a little while. And the thing that helped me overcome this was my mom kind of saw this behavior and was like, oh, we gotta stop this. And so she encouraged me to kind of ask her lots of questions and talk about my feelings, and she would always answer them honestly, which is really, really important when we talk to children about death. But a really big thing is that she encouraged me to kind of explore these feelings creatively. So whether it was through drawing or writing or whatever. And the thing that helped me overcome my death anxiety, at least partly, was a Majora's Mask. And so I remember renting it from Blockbuster, and I became obsessed with this game. I loved it so much. And I liked it because Majora's Mask, like on the whole, is very, very, very death-centric. There's a lot of death going on. You interact with it a lot. But very explicitly, I remember the villagers in Clocktown, so like the main hub area of this game. They don't know that the moon, like the premise is like the moon's crashing into the earth and you need to stop it by rewinding time. They don't know that you can do that. They don't know that you can rewind time and that you're actively trying to save them. So all they know is that they are going to die. And people deal with this in different ways. So some deny it completely, like the carpenters. Some people, like the soldiers, are like, we gotta evacuate the town. We'll be safe from the moon crashing into the earth. But some people just continue on with their lives. And that was the thing that stuck with me the most, is that the mailman's like, well, I'm still gonna deliver the mail, even if I'm gonna die tomorrow. And I remember just being like, whoa, this is amazing. And I remember that helping me so much with like dealing with my own mortality. And I played that game so much, specifically just like that town. I just wanted to like talk to people and see how they were all dealing with it. So not only did it help me get over some of my death anxiety, but it also aided my professional curiosity about this intersection. So fast forward to 2015, a book was recommended to me called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which was written by this person here called Caitlin Doty. And she is a LA-based mortician / YouTuber / author, and her book is a semi-autographical tale about her job and how she got into the industry, and how she went from, being like an intern to going to school and kind of seeing some weird, shady stuff with the industry, and then starting her own business. And it's really, really good. It's really well written and very funny. But it also introduced me to the idea of death acceptance or death positivity. The death positive movement, kind of similar to sex positivity, is the idea that the more we talk about taboo subjects, the less scary they are, and the better equipped we are to make decisions for ourselves and our loved ones about these scary topics. So in Western culture, America, Canada specifically, we're really, really bad about talking about death. We're really, really bad about pretending it doesn't exist and dealing with it really poorly when it does happen. And so the idea of death positivity is not to remove these feelings of grief or sadness. It isn't like, Grandma died and I'm fine with it. It's just the idea that death and grief are sad. They're always going to be sad, but if we're okay with confronting these things and lifting the veil on the death industry, we are better equipped to make decisions for ourselves and our loved ones when we inevitably die. And I resonated with this idea a lot, especially as a person who overcame my own death anxiety through interacting with it directly. And this is also what inspired A Mortician's Tale. So, Caitlin's story was really, really fascinating, but I was also really into the idea of creating a video game about the Western death industry specifically, where players could directly interact with those themes. And my goals were to maybe encourage the players to learn something about certain processes behind cremation and burial, but also learn about the Western death industry as a whole. And kind of one of our sub-goals too was that maybe we could encourage people who have death anxiety to maybe comfortably overcome it the way that I did with Majora's Mask. So in order to support our goals, like these goals I just mentioned, we needed to be as accurate as possible, right? We did our research, we talked to a lot of death professionals. Specifically myself, a lot of the things I did was look at certain procedures. So doing a lot of research on procedures, talking to a lot of death professionals about things like embalming and cremation. Our writer, Caitlin Tremblay, she did a lot of research about grief and kind of the spectrum of grief. So grief isn't just sadness. It can sometimes be anger, it can be denial, it can be happy, it can be you talking about Netflix at a funeral. It's so broad, and Caitlin did a really, really good job at exploring this and doing her research on it. A big thing that we did too, that was really important, is that we drew upon our own experiences with death and grief. And we made sure to explore our personal experiences with it in the game. So A Mortician's Tale started out as my personal game that I was planning on making by myself. I was very lucky and I got some funding and I was able to hire a team. And that was great because A Mortician's Tale grew to be a collection of all of our experiences with death, not just mine, but our whole team. And I think it's a lot better of a game because of that. Adding personal bits of our experiences with the subject matter is very important. One of our goals was to get players hands-on with the processes behind cremation and burials, and to learn these processes in a hands-on way. So in video games, it's pretty typical that when there's a lot of bodies or zombies or whatever, when they're killed off, their bodies just kind of disappear. And the mechanic exists for a reason. But in A Mortician's Tale, we're asking players to deal with that body directly. And players take care of bodies in the game the way that funeral directors take care of our bodies in real life when we die. And so in the game, you don't know any of the people that you're taking care of. It isn't like, oh, surprise, it's your sister. You're all strangers. And again, like I think pretty typically in game when people die, like narratively, it's always someone that you know that you're connected to. But in this game, we've asked players to take care of someone that they don't know or love. And something that we learned when we were doing a lot of research on the game and talking to a lot of, like Caitlin Doty and a lot of death professionals, was that it's really, really important that you spend time with the body after they've died. It's a really, really important part of the grieving process. And if you're from any other part of the world, this is probably a normal thing for you, but for, again, America and Canada, this is not a thing we do. We're very much like, okay, grandma's gone, bye, see you at the funeral. And so we wanted to make sure that we put the camera first person during these medical procedures, and that we made sure that players spent a lot of time with each respective body. In getting players to directly interact with subject matters, it was important for us to be comfortable and finding that balance of accuracy and comfort. And we know this because the subject matter can be really uncomfortable for people, so finding that balance is really important to us. And one way we do this is the color palette. So I prototyped this game a couple of years ago using Pico 8, which has very, very few colors, and I kind of used a couple of purple colors. And when we moved this over to Unity and made it a 3D game, I was like, I still like this palette. I'm gonna kind of keep going with this. One, because I think it really works with like the melancholy but hopeful vibe, but I think it also really does a good job at masking some of the grosser things in the game. So again, there's no like bodily fluids, there's no jaundiced skin, there's nothing gross like that. The purple kind of hides a lot of the stuff and allows us to, again, like explore these things accurately without being too realistic about it. Another thing that we do too is kind of humanoid figures. All of the bodies, all the people in the game, yourself included, kind of have larger heads and larger eyes, and this is just to avoid uncanny valley. We also, in order for us to be comfortable, we had to sacrifice some accuracy. We didn't include a lot of things that are part of the procedures behind embalming, for example. The game is not a one-to-one simulation, but it's just very, very accurate still. So, mechanics-wise, Mortician's Tale is a narrative-first game. Narrative is the pillar of A Mortician's Tale. And it was really, really important for us that everything else in the game supported this narrative. So the sounds, the music, the mechanics as well. And so for the medical parts of A Mortician's Tale, we were really inspired by Trauma Center, which is a game series that you play as a surgeon. But in Trauma Center, because you're playing as a surgeon, they do this cool thing where the game has a timer and a score and fail states. So it's very, very, very stressful, and it's trying to recreate the feeling of being a surgeon and having some urgency and trying to save this person's life. So in contrast, A Mortician's Tale is very much the opposite. There is no urgency to it. We don't let you have fail states, right? That was one of kind of the biggest critiques about the game was people were like, I wish it could fail. I wish it could accidentally cut somebody. But if we let you fail, you're disrespecting the body. We are allowing you to disrespect people. And so we took that out of the game. So yeah, the game's a little bit on the rails, but it was designed intentionally to support the narrative of the game. One decision we made as well is that the game has no dialogue options. You are a silent protagonist. And we did this for a few reasons. One is because every single person deals with grief differently and death differently. And so it felt really weird for us to have a fully fleshed out character like a Nathan Drake character, and that the player has to kind of like take control of. So it was better for us to create a silent protagonist that could act as a vessel for the player to kind of insert themselves and their own feelings and own experiences in. But it also, we did this because it also places the importance of listening rather than talking. You're not worried about like what you are or not supposed to say. You're just worried about, not worried, but the goal is to just listen to people and listen to what they're like saying to you. And that is a big part of being a mortician in real life. A lot of your job is not to tell someone how to grieve, it's to listen to them when they are grieving. So that was really important for us to be accurate in that way. Regarding the goal of being accurate, we wanted to be accurate not just with technical and medical stuff, but also with the emotional parts of the job. So one of the things that I asked all of our mortician friends that we were making the game is if there was ever a point where they couldn't do their job, where they had to say, I can't do this, someone else has to deal with this guy, or whatever. And in my mind, I think it's like a gore thing or like a body thing, but every single one of them responded with the exact same answer, which was yes, and it was always based off of the story behind the person. So it was never like, the procedure is the exact same as what they've always done in their life, but because they knew the story behind the person, it made it too hard for them to deal with. And so we wanted to kind of make sure we were being accurate with that. So in the game, when you start out, depending on who you are, maybe it's a bit shocking to you that there's a body on the screen. But then we kind of, it's very ritualistic. Everything is kind of the same. The procedures are the same. Maybe you get a little bit used to it. And towards the end of the game, we have a couple bodies that, again, same procedures, but their stories are a little bit sadder. And this was really cool to see because when the game came out, we saw a lot of streamers and YouTubers play the game, and they got to those parts of the game. And even though, again, the procedures are the exact same, we didn't change a single thing mechanically, every single person spent way more time on those bodies than they did the beginning bodies. So that was pretty neat. All right, I want to talk about the reaction. So we released this game in October, and we were met with lots of critical success, which is very nice, but also really cool was that we received a lot of messages and emails and DMs from people sharing personal stories about how the game really, really resonated with them, how the game helped them grieve. There's a lot. How the game helped them make decisions after they played the game and then someone died and the game helped them make decisions regarding those processes, or how to support someone who was grieving. And a lot of people messaged us saying how they deal with death anxiety and how the game has helped them kind of overcome it a little bit, which is really cool. Also a lot of fan art and cosplay, which I'm a big fan of, so that's pretty neat. When we made the game, we expected no one to like it. It's super niche, we understand, but it's really cool that players are interested in the subject matter, that they're interested in exploring their own feelings about it, and that the design decisions we made are having a positive impact on people. And we are not the only ones who are innovating on how death is used in games. So, I think indie games, indie developers in particular, are doing some really, really cool things with death. Thinking outside how we traditionally use death in games, bringing their own experiences to the table, sharing stories from a variety of cultural backgrounds. Here are some recent examples. We've seen lots of really cool innovations on the narrative side, whether it's thematically via Night in the Woods or speed dating for ghosts, or very explicitly like The Graveyard and The Walking Dead. There's a lot of games that combine narrative with interesting mechanics to create immersive experiences with death and grief. There are games that are exploring kind of new mechanics, and in the case of Eve Valkyrie, new mediums like VR. And we're seeing lots of games that are using existing mechanics to still tell stories about death and grief, genocide, family legacy, or even horror. These are just a few examples. There's lots more games that I could have included in here, but all of these games deal with death in their own unique ways, and they're very popular with players, and they're really, really good and powerful because they each use death mechanics that best suit their respective games. So how can you do the same? If you're interested in using death in your games, what is the best way that you can use it for your game? So like I mentioned, it's important to talk about and think about what death best fits your personal game. If your game is mechanics first, like a roguelike or FPS, everything else in your game should support it and should include narrative. So Guacamelee is a fantastic example of this, right? And one of the big mechanics in Guacamelee is you're shifting between two worlds, and there's a lot of combat mechanics that are really interesting about that. So the narrative, which is, flipping between the world of the living and world of the dead, fits very nicely with that, and the aesthetic looks very cool too. The sound design changes when you flip over. Everything supports that mechanic really well. If your game is narrative first, if the pillar of your game is narrative, like a Mortician's Tale, whether it's a visual novel or a first-person narrative game, everything else in your game should support that. So Edith Finch, fantastic example of this, right? Edith Finch mechanics do a really, really good job at getting the player to directly interact with different deaths. They do a really good job with that. And make sure that you're not just relying on traditional death mechanics. They're fine, respawning exists for a reason, life systems exist for a reason, but it's really important that you figure out what best suits your game's design. And as much as I'm like, death is great, how are you guys using it in your games? It's also important to think about, is death even necessary in your game? If you're making a game like Animal Crossing, do you need to have death in it? Does it support what Animal Crossing is doing? Just think about that. Specifically, if you are working with death, the way that we kind of did, it's really, really important for you to do your research and consult. Do interviews, do consultations. The internet can be a really good resource. There was a lot of really gross stuff that we found when I was doing research for Mortician's Tale, so just be careful if you're squeamish. But really, really importantly is to be respectful. That is the most important thing, not just with dealing with dead bodies, but also with how other cultures are treating death. If you're interested in exploring that, make sure that you are consulting and paying your consultants. And if you're, again, exploring death kind of explicitly, make sure that you're being understanding with your players, especially like for very, very personal games like a Mortician's Tale. Death and grief is very hard for a lot of people, and so it's really important to kind of think about and make adjustments as necessary. A really good also, understand playtesting is not indicative of final play session. I talked to Ian Dallas, who's the creative director of Edith Finch, one of my podcast episodes, and he told me a story about how during playtesting, people would be like, this game's great, this is cool. And the same people would go home and then like message him and be like, I bawled my eyes out. And he was like, why didn't you cry here? So, if you're playtesting your games, understand, I don't think he actually said that, but in my brain, that's, if you're playtesting your game and you're not getting the response you want, you're not like, is this game sad enough? Understand that playing games by yourself is very different than playing games when someone's standing over your shoulder watching you. Death is really personal. And it's really important that, again, if you're dealing with death, that you assess your own feelings, because it can be really hard as a developer to work on these games for 2 or 3 years. It's really, really important to be comfortable and when you're having discussions or doing research, et cetera, and making sure that not just you, but your team is also comfortable with the subject matter, right? Our sound designer, Jen Costa, did a lot of research to make sure the sounds were accurate, and she had to listen to like hours and hours of embalming music. If she was not comfortable with that, the game would have been very, very different. So it's really, really important that if you want to explore this topic as deeply as we did, that you're just somewhat comfortable with it. And self-care is important, whether you're making a game about death or just very, very gory game or whatever. It's really important to kind of take a step back sometimes and just be away from it. And self-care can be things like having a bath or going for a run, or if you're me, it's watching Riverdale. It's a terrible show. I love it so much. It's so good. And if you're, very importantly, if you're not a person who is comfortable with death, maybe consider exploring those feelings about it. If you're not comfortable with it, consider making a game about those feelings, because it can be very therapeutic. Ultimately, developing Mortician's Tale has changed me for the better. I've learned so much from it, and I've taken those experiences with me when people I know have died. And so I hope if you decide to explore this topic, that it can be as therapeutic for you as it was for me. Thank you so much. Ooh.